Good morning. I'm Kevin Hallock. I'm president of the University of Richmond. It's my pleasure to welcome Congressman McEachin, Senator Ghazala, Hashmi, Delegate Delores McQuinn, members of the media, members of the university's Burying Ground Memorialization Committee, and other guests to our campus. Congressman McEachin is here today at the University of Richmond to discuss the African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act. This important bipartisan bill would establish the United States African American Burying Grounds Preservation Program within the National Park Service. Preserving African American burial grounds contributes to a fuller and more accurate understanding of American history. Confronting the past is challenging, especially when it surfaces uncomfortable truths. But it's the right thing to do. I'm proud of the excellent work of the University of Richmond's Burying Ground Memorialization Committee in recommending design concepts for a memorial to honor the enslaved persons who lived and labored on the land that is now our campus, and the burying ground in which we believe some were laid to rest. And I'm grateful to the committee for so thoughtfully engaging our campus and broader community in constructive dialogue about this important history. I would now like to introduce Keith McIntosh, the university's Vice President for Information Services and co-chair of the university's Burying Ground Memorialization Committee, who will provide more information on the work of the committee and then introduce Delegate McQuinn.
Thank you, President Hallock. Good morning. My name is Keith McIntosh, and I'm the Vice President for Information Services and Chief Information Officer at the University of Richmond. It is my distinct honor to have served as the co-chair for the University of Richmond's Burying Ground Memorialization Committee, along with Dr. Ed Ayers. The Burying Ground Memorialization Committee was established in January of 2020 by our former University of Richmond President, Dr. Ronald A. Crutcher. It included students, faculty, and staff. The committee was in charge with engaging a wide range of stakeholders, including members of the descendant community, in discussions about memorializing the burial ground for enslaved people located on what is now our campus and the history of this land. I would like to take this time to acknowledge and thank Dr. Lornette Lee, who directed our research, and Ms. Shelby Driscoll, who conducted extensive original research discovering names of dozens of enslaved people who worked on the plantations and farms that occupied this land prior to the university's acquisition of the site. We are also grateful to Mrs. Brenda Dabney Nichols, author and Henrico County public historian, who worked with the committee to identify more than 100 descendants of the families most likely to have had relatives interred in the burying ground. The committee met with those descendants at the burying ground site and at other locations, and with university students, faculty, and staff to establish principles to guide the memorialization. Collaboration with two skilled architects experienced in memorialization of enslaved people in Virginia and beyond helped place our work in larger context and advance our conversations toward concrete solutions. From those dozens of conversations, leading design principles emerged. The burying ground site should remain sacred and lightly touched. The burying ground should be unique, accessible, and inviting. The burying ground should balance sentiments of reconciliation and resilience with the certainty of an enduring struggle. Based on that work, the committee has recommended 3 possible design concepts to honor people interred in the burying ground. More information about the work of the committee is available on the University of Richmond's website. At the end of today's presentation, we will have someone available to walk you over to the burying ground site. It is now my honor to introduce Delegate Delores McQuinn. Delegate McQuinn was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates in 2009 and represents House District 70. She currently serves on the House Transportation, Education, and Appropriations Committees. Delegate McQuinn, we are delighted to have you join us here today.
Good morning, and thank you for that introduction. Good morning to certainly Congressman McEachin, others who are joined here, President, University, other guests, my good friend, Dr. Laurinette Lee and Brenda Nichols. So good to see you always in terms of doing this great work. This landmark, and I want to certainly honor Congressman McEachin for his work. It's been amazing, and his focus over the past years on the preservation of cemeteries and other sites have been, again, phenomenal work. But this landmark and bipartisan piece of legislation that's been introduced is a monumental effort in raising the acknowledgement that these sacred sites of abandonment and significant places are relevant to Americans' history. They are a part of American history. For entirely too long, the preservation of African American cemeteries were out of sight, therefore out of mind, hidden in the boughs of vegetation, trees, roots, and even asphalt were buried names of individuals who contribute to the economic prosperity. To be truthful, of white slave owners, traders, and their families. We are still calculating in America the final cost of slavery and Jim Crow and other ways of oppressing individuals in America. The African American Burial Ground Preservation Act adds to the ongoing cost of slavery and Jim Crow and the depth of humanizing our ancestors and making their lives once again relevant. Congressman, I joined in partnership with you to do this work. This is another step toward dismantling systemic racism that for far too long served as an albatross around the neck of enslaved African Americans and their descendants. So we honor you for your great work with what you are doing on the national level to change the trajectory, change the narrative. Cemeteries connect us to the past. It connects the past to the present. And I'm reminded in Ezekiel 37:110, and I'm sure that Congressman is aware of that. And in that scripture in the Bible, God asked me, and that's what this is Ezekiel said, "Son of man, can these bones live?" And I said, "Sovereign God, sovereign Lord, you alone know." Then he said to me, "Prophesy to the bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord said to the bones. And I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life." Congressman, I have worked to do this, have worked in Virginia with introducing legislation from 2010 until now in an effort to preserve our history, whether cemeteries or sites of significance, or the roots. That work we have done, I want you to know, it breathed life into these dry bones. And the dry bones will forever live because of the work that you are doing on the federal level, and it will continue to live in the Commonwealth of Virginia and all across this nation. Dry bones will live because of the resources and investment that we are putting into this. Thank you so much for your work. And at this time, I have the honor of introducing one of my colleagues in the General Assembly, Senator Hashmi. Senator Ghazala Hashmi is the first Muslim American to serve in the Virginia State Senate. She represents the 10th District, which includes Powhatan County, Chesterfield, and Richmond City. She serves on the Agricultural, Conservation, and Natural Resource, Education and Health, General Laws and Technology, and Local Government. Obviously, she is very busy. She actually had a companion bill to my House Bill 141, which the Senate Bill 158 focused on the Virginia Black, Indigenous, and People of Color Historic Preservation Fund. Her and her husband moved here in 1991. She has spent the last 30 years as a leading educator in Virginia colleges and university system. She served both as a professor of English and as the founding director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning at Reynolds Community College. She has 2 daughters who were born and raised in Lothian and Chesterfield. We will not hold that against her. And Senator Hashmi holds a BA in English from Georgia Southern University and a PhD in American Literature from Emory University. At this time, I present to you and introduce to some a woman who's a principal of integrity, social justice, and ethics in government. She is indeed a treasured individual in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Thank you.
Thank you so much to my friend Delegate McQuinn for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate that. And good morning to everybody who's here. Thank you, President Hallock, for hosting this important day. Thank you, Congressman, for all your work. And thank you, Dr. McIntosh, for all the efforts that the university has made in this critical area. And as I don't know that I can follow the eloquence of Delegate McQuinn, the breathing of life into dry bones. What an apt and beautiful metaphor for the critical work that preservationists and historians throughout the Commonwealth have been engaged in, and how particularly critical it is in this moment in our history. And as Delegate McQuinn highlighted, I've been honored to carry SB 158, which is the Virginia Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, or BIPOC, Historic Preservation Fund. And this work, I think, is a good companion to the work that's happening at the federal level. And so I want to highlight a little bit of what this fund is now going to do for the Commonwealth. This legislation gives our Virginia Department of Historic Resources funds to provide grants for the acquisition, protection, and rehabilitation of tribal lands and historic and archaeological sites of significance that are associated with our Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. This grant program focuses specifically on the efforts to protect and support Virginia's historically underserved and underrepresented communities and the cultural and the historic sites that are associated with them. We already have important precedents in Virginia of historic preservation. Currently, the Commonwealth supports the Virginia Land Conservation Foundation, the Virginia Battlefield Preservation Fund, and the Virginia Outdoors Foundation Preservation Trust Fund. These are grant programs that are dedicated to the acquisition and protection of battlefields, farmlands, parks, forests, and natural areas. However, we've never had a grant fund that targets the cultural and historic sites of our Black, Indigenous, and People of Color communities. And our story of Virginia has been absolutely incomplete without this level of support. Since 1997, nearly $80 million have been appropriated to protect battlefields, farmlands, parks, forests, and natural areas. But the recent analysis of these existing grant programs revealed that little to no funding has actually benefited the properties that are historically associated with our BIPOC communities. And so Governor Northam's final introduced budget included $10 million for the BIPOC Preservation Fund. Both the House and the Senate budgets now include $5 million for the next biennium. This funding only begins to bring a level of equity to the grant programs that are historically offered by the Commonwealth. This funding is truly a matter of historic justice. It's a vital next step in fulfilling the Commonwealth's commitment to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. These efforts represent a significant move towards righting the inequitable distribution of land and property since the first settlers arrived in Virginia, and the systemic inequality that has limited access to funding sources for these underrepresented communities. And so I'd like to emphasize an essential idea, and that is this: we preserve what we value. The fundamental argument behind establishing the BIPOC Preservation Fund is that by seeking to preserve, we at long last demonstrate the value that we place on cultural and historic sites representing our BIPOC communities. And now it's my great honor to introduce Congressman Donald McEachin. My husband and I moved to this area in 1991, and Congressman, I think that we've been following your political career and its trajectory since that time, so well over 3 decades. Congressman McEachin has served in our House of Delegates beginning in 1996 and then 2 terms in the Senate of Virginia, and he's been our congressional representative for the greater Richmond area since 2016. Importantly for us here today, we're here to commend the steadfast efforts of our Congressman in preserving the full story of Virginia, and indeed this is the full story of this country. And some of his efforts have already included the critical endorsement of the nomination of the Shockoe Hill African Burying Ground to the National Registry of Historic Places, the introduction of the African American Burial Grounds Network Act to create a federal network of historic African American cemeteries, and of course, and most recently, the African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act. Congressman, thank you so much for your dedication, your leadership, your decades of public service for our communities.
Thank you, Senator, for that wonderful introduction. Mr. President, to all those who are gathered, to our delegate, it's good to be with you all. It's, I guess we're trending towards the afternoon at this point. I have to diverge from my prepared remarks for just a moment and share with you sort of where this passion originated from, at least in my soul. And speaking of souls, you know, the good Reverend is taking us to church, so I feel like saying amen. Thank you for that, and thank you for reminding us that we are breathing life into old, dry bones. But when I was a member of the House of Delegates, I remember looking at the budget in my first years there, and I noticed that we were spending, I think, don't quote me on this number, don't hold me to the number, but it was either like $25 or $50 per Confederate grave. And we were paying that money to the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and regardless of how I feel about the Confederacy, my point was that we're going to preserve a piece of history. We should preserve all of history. And so I began efforts to introduce not as sophisticated a bill as the delegate and the senator did, but I began efforts to put together a bill to preserve the graves of slaves. Well, I didn't succeed in that effort, but thanks to folks like the delegate and the senator, the spirit of that effort has continued, and the spirit of that effort has been enacted. And by the way, we all need to tip our hats to the delegate, because, you know, maybe many years from now, when she finally decides that she's had enough of this, among her legacies will be the fact that she led the way in preserving history, regardless of what level of government she was at, whether it was city government or state government. She has consistently been concerned about history, whether it's the slave trade, whether it's what do we call it, Delores? The reunification, reconciliation statute, and of course the efforts that were just outlined today. Preserving history, breathing life into old bones. You know, I'm going to get into a little trouble here because the media is here, but I'm going to just go ahead and say it and get it out of the way. It is critical, it's based on race, and it is fact. It is not theory. Our nation was built on the backs of generations of hardworking African American men and women, many of whom spent their entire life dealing with segregation, marginalization, and yes, in the case of some, slavery. And for too many of those oppressive forces continued even after death. From the inception of our country up through Jim Crow and into the middle of the 20th century, African Americans could not be buried with white Americans. Desperate to find a suitable place for their deceased African Americans across the nation created cemeteries, burial grounds, and other resting places where they could inter the departed and return to pay their respects. However, with no governmental assistance, many of these resting places were lost over the years to a lack of tracking and designation, to the elements, and the overgrowth. The preservation of African American burial grounds is of the utmost importance and imperative if we're going to have a better and more comprehensive understanding of our nation's history. This year's legislation, the African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act, takes more immediate steps by establishing grant opportunities and providing technical assistance from the National Park Service to preserve these sites. The legislation helps support the identification, preservation, and restoration of these sites and provides technical assistance. The African American Burial Ground Preservation Act will provide $3 million a year to the National Park Service to assist in these ongoing efforts. Formative African American figures from the Commonwealth and states across the nation are buried in these grounds, many of which have been lost and forgotten. The reclamation and preservation of these sites is important, not just for the families of the departed, but for all of us. African American burial grounds are important historical sites that possess the untold stories of millions who came before us and helped shape our nation. Unfortunately, with no formal database or historical record and no federal legislation to preserve and protect these sites, we're missing out on key pieces of our history. That's why I have been working at the federal level to put forth vital bipartisan legislation to preserve and protect them. And that's why I'm proud to announce the introduction of the African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act. Among those who are working on this act with me is my colleague, Congressman Adams from North Carolina, Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania, Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio, and Senator Mitt Romney from Utah. As you can see, is bipartisan and bicameral. As a nation, we have failed to expend the necessary resources and efforts to preserve these sites. We are long overdue in investing in their identification, preservation, and restoration. I could go on and continue to talk for the rest of the afternoon, but I want to make sure that I commend the University of Richmond for its efforts to preserve sites like the Weston Burying Ground right here on campus. Such an area would be eligible for funds should the university elect to take that route. And as I understand it, it's just a stone's throw away from where we are right now. So with that, again, I'm going to resist the temptation to talk the rest of the afternoon and thank the university for hosting this, and thank my colleagues. It's good to see both of you all again. And thank all of you all for being here as we celebrate us becoming a more perfect union in terms of celebrating our history. Thank you.